So when we're looking at our sexuality and sexual health, we're looking at pleasure and arousal. The main resource for this is Emily Nagoski's work, and in particular, her book, Come As You Are, which has now been revised. It's a New York Times bestseller. And she's a sex educator at one of the universities on the Eastern Seaboard. What she talks about is how we can overcome trauma, sexual trauma. We can develop a deeper relationship with ourselves and our sexuality. And part of that is through education. I found the research and the new things that they know about our bodies, and some things I knew already and many things I didn't, to be very inspiring and entertaining. And also through the retreat that I was facilitating with, many of the people there were younger. Things really are changing in the generations, and I found that very helpful and very inspiring as well. So that book is a great resource, Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, and also on her website. Let's talk about desire. All the way through the book, and I have to say that book is very trauma-informed and science-based, very sex-positive, and very practical. Some of the research that she talks about are things that we can really work with in our own lives. Desire equals pleasure in context. Interesting way to put that. Arousal is in our brains, not our genitals. So it's highly affected by our nervous system. We work so thoroughly with our nervous systems. What are we feeling? What is the perception of threat? How does that work? She talks about two types of desire. Spontaneous desire is where it's not related to a particular experience that you're having. So responsive desire appears in response to pleasure. So if you're with yourself and you're kind of just noticing how beautiful it feels for your skin to be in touch with other skin, or if you're with a partner and you're experiencing pleasure, then desire may emerge. Many women are more likely to experience responsive desire, and some men experience this as well. So the desire isn't necessarily there in terms of images or watching a sexy movie or something like that. It's in response to feeling pleasure. Now, spontaneous desire is more likely something that men experience, although many women don't experience spontaneous desire and many women do. So these are gendered to some extent, and part of that, and a lot of that has to do with our conditioning. Some of it has to do with our anatomy. So spontaneous desire is when we anticipate sexual pleasure. And it could be thinking ahead to date night. It could be in response to a movie or some kind of sexual cues. In our culture, it's a little bit difficult because women are often the subject of the male gaze, the male sexual gaze in particular. So that's something that we could bring into this equation in terms of what is gendered, what isn't, what's conditioned. We live in a patriarchy, and we live in a culture that conditions and objectifies women. So those are never absent from this equation. And we also live in these bodies, which are different depending on our genitals. Are they organized in a female standard configuration or in a male? So one of the terms that I had never heard of before is arousal non-concordance. And again, she's pointing to the complexity of our responses. That genital response doesn't always match a person's experience of arousal. What she points to in some of the examples that she's using there are if there's a lack of lubrication for a woman, it doesn't necessarily mean she's not interested. And a lot of lubrication doesn't necessarily mean she is interested. So the relationship between the genitals and the brain aren't always the same. That what is sex related and sexually appealing is another part of this arousal non-concordance. So sexual relatedness might mean if you see a picture, if you see somebody that you find sexually appealing, those are sexually related. Again, it has something to do with the way that we perceive arousal. we can notice something and feel and notice that it's sexually related, but not find it sexually appealing. So for me, if I was to see a handsome man, for instance, Ricky Martin comes to mind. He's very sexual. There's a lot of, the women are screaming and yelling his name. And I remember seeing a video of him many years ago. And so that's not something that I'm going to find sexually appealing necessarily, although I would find it sexually related. So we all have those things. And they overlap about 50% of the time for men and 10% of the time for women. That's significant by gender as well. So 50% of the time, if it's sexually related, a man might be aroused, and only 10% of the time would that be true for women. Now, these are research studies. These are things that they've been researching in labs, and they apply a lot to the real world and not necessarily to us individually. One of the reasons that I brought this forward out of her book, and that she really talks about this, is that we can respond, our genitals can respond to something that we know is wrong and that we don't actually want. And that is important to know. Sometimes men will find that they have a sexual response to something that is objectifying or something that they would never do in real life. And the same for women. Sometimes this has to do with fantasies of being held down or consensual sex play, those kinds of things that are not necessarily in alignment with how we see ourselves. The response and the arousal are not the same thing. The arousal itself depends on our brakes and the accelerator. So arousal non-concordance. That's a big, long term for something that basically means we can be noticing something and have a response in our body and not necessarily be aroused, or to not have a response of, for instance, lubrication in the vulva area, but we can still be aroused. So what that really points to as well is that we need to be paying attention to more than just the physical signs. We need to be listening if you have a partner, and listening to yourself as well. So there is a central mechanism around sexual arousal, and it controls how we respond to sexually relevant sights, sounds, sensations, and ideas. And this central nervous system that we work with all the time has many partnerships like that. We talk about the vagal brake, for instance, where we get anxious and then we put the brakes on. We sometimes deliberately use tools, like might do box breathing if we find that we're getting really into kind of an anxious or panicky state. So this is the way the central nervous system works, and it works a similar way for sexual desire and arousal. Another thing that's related to this as well is that it's unconscious. So we talk about neuroception all the time as the unconscious perception of threat and safety. And sexual response is also an unconscious process. We're not really aware of what's happening in our conscious mind until a certain point in the process. So just as our brain constantly searches and scans the environment through our eyes, a lot of it, but other ways too, for danger, we're also scanning the environment for anything that's sexually relevant. So it might be that we're looking outside. It might be that we're scanning our own thoughts. This is a process that's happening well below the surface. And then the brakes are what kind of stops the process. And it can be something that we have happening all the time, but it responds to good reasons. So, if you're wanting to have a sexual encounter with your partner and the kids are in the next room, that's going to be putting on the brakes. You might still get turned on and have that kind of looking forward to it later, but you're not going to be able to actually follow through on something. So we have these brakes, the neurological off signals. And there's two parts to that. So one part notices potential threats, like a kid could come into the room. We're out in public right now. I don't want someone to see us, something like that. And then the other part of the brakes worries about failure. Am I going to please my partner? Are they going to like my body? What if I don't have an orgasm? So there's two. One part notices potential threat, and the other worries about failure. So we have a gas pedal and a brake pedal. And for the purposes of today in particular, I'm going to work more with the brake pedal. And I was thinking about this earlier. Normally, when we're doing any kind of our practices, what we do is we deal with the fear, for instance, or we deal with the disconnection. We do these practices that really bring us in to our experience, to our body, to a feeling of safety. And the same with meditation. We work with what's disturbing the mind. And then as the disturbance is leaving, as we're starting to not be so distracted by the compulsive thoughts or by anxiety in our body, then what's left is what we can enjoy, the stillness, the relaxation. So we don't really meditate. We remove the obstacles to meditation, and then the meditation happens. And so it's very similar approach here is if we work with what the brakes are, we take the offs off, then the ons will just naturally be there. So one of the gender differences around anatomy is that boys have a very obvious way to track if they're sexually aroused or not. They have sensations in their penis, and it's linked to the responses from their environment. And boys and girls are conditioned very differently as well. So we learn, just like everything else, we learn from our experience and through association. So girls and women tend to be more interested in the social context, the other people who are there with them, the partnership, the safety of the situation, the social context. We all have these two systems, the part of it that excites us and the part of it that inhibits us. That's what we're going to kind of look at a little bit to delve into how those work for us personally. One of the things that research has shown is that we can't really change the mechanisms themselves. Some people have a very sensitive system of excitement, and some people have a lot more breaks. But what we can do is change what we consider sexually relevant and what we respond to. So again, that's a deep area of research that we're not going to have a chance to get too much into, but that it's good to know that those are there. And again, I highly recommend Dr. Nagoski's book, Come As You Are. There's a lot in there that, of course, we'll never get to here because we don't have time. So let's let all of that settle for a minute. And I'm going to leave the share on while we're doing the inquiry. And you could scan the different sentences. And there's quite a few of them here. And we're going to do this for about 10 minutes or so. If you have time, we don't need to rush through it. And there might be one or two of them that you really want to spend some time with. So like everything else that we do, come back into your body. What's the feeling? What's the felt sense in your body right now? Notice your breath. And at any time, we can always back away from this. You could do some tapping on your forehead if thoughts are getting too kind of intense or they're really grabbing your attention. You could do some deeper breaths. You could decide to look at some of this later on. We don't have to be pushy with ourselves. I'm going to go through the sentences with a pause between each. And then you can work with them however you want. So if you're wanting to work with one or two of them in particular, you could kind of tune me out, and otherwise just to sit back, relax, and I'll talk about them. And these are mostly reflections on what turns us off, with the idea that as we limit what turns us off, as we work with some of those inhibitors, then the field will be more open for what turns us on. But we're not going to specifically talk about that today. Things have to be just right for me to become sexually aroused. And as you're working with that, you could just sense into that. Is that always true? Is it mostly true? Hardly ever true? And we haven't really worked with the conditioning and the shame. So you might notice that shame comes up. Well, I hardly ever become sexually aroused, or I'm so sensitive to things that turn off. Or it might be the opposite. I get really easily sexually aroused, and I don't know if that's very good. So let's just see, what is your response to the sentences to feel mostly true, not so true, and what else comes up? My partner likes sex when they're stressed, and I like to be left alone. When I'm tired or stressed, that's the last thing I want. None of these are morally superior. Some people like to have sex when they're stressed, some don't, but we might have some shame around that. Continue to notice your body, your breath. Where do you fit in that one? I don't feel emotionally close enough to them right now. I don't want to even be touched right now. I don't feel like we're connected enough. And if you're in a partnership, you might be thinking about a partner or partners. If you're mostly, your sexuality is expressed through a partnership with yourself, you don't have to be in a relationship with another person to be working with these. It could be when we're disconnected from ourselves. I worry about taking too long to become aroused or orgasm. And notice that our history comes into the present moment here as well. If you've had a history of somebody being impatient with you or other kinds of experiences around arousal and orgasm, that will also affect how you feel now. This may be something that you've worked with a long time, or maybe it's something newer, or maybe it doesn't apply at all. I feel shy or self conscious about my body. If we think back to our teen years, which is when many of us start to experiment sexually, either with ourselves or sometimes with other people, it's certainly something that we have a lot of focus on in our culture. And we often feel very vulnerable around our body, very self conscious. So notice there's a history here as well. And how do you feel now in this moment, wherever you are in your adult life? In any one of these, reflections or inquiry statements could be something that we work with separately and really feel into. These are all very common inhibitors. Continue to notice your body, your breath. I have to trust a partner to become fully aroused. And this could be trust around safety and honoring my boundaries and what I enjoy. So I need to know that they care about my sexual pleasure and my overall health. So it could be that they honor birth control or protection against sexually transmitted infection. I need to know that they care about more than just the sex. They care about me. And notice where your mind is right now. Your mind might have gone off into the past, might be thinking about something else completely. And that so often happens during sex as well, especially if there's been sexual trauma in your past. So, one of the ways that the brakes might go on is that we disconnect and our mind goes somewhere else. Notice if that's your experience. Or you suddenly realize that you don't want to do this anymore, or maybe you don't want to do this with that person. And in the context of your relationship with a partner, how able are you to communicate your truth? Can you talk about things before? If something happens in the middle of it, can you say, this is pleasurable to me, this is not? And after as well, what is your relationship like with that person? And beginning inside, can you identify, I'm feeling this way? And then can you share that? And we could just notice the complexity and the elements of that, hopefully without shaming ourselves. In this toxic sexual environment, we might not feel like we can really say, if we're really disconnected, we might not really know. We might have the conditioning that says it's not okay to stop in the middle. I should just grit my teeth and get through it. Or that may be something that you completely rejected and you would never do that anymore, or maybe ever. So just to notice, what are some of the elements for you around knowing how you feel and being able to communicate that with a partner? And there might be lots of memories coming in. So stay present, do some tapping on your forehead if you need to, do some breathing, hold your own hands. And then let go of the inquiry and let it kind of bubble up to the top. You can look back at the different sentences if you want. What were one or two that were particularly interesting for you or particularly meaningful?